Every empire in human history has ended. That is a stark sentence, and it holds up. Akkad, Egypt's new kingdom, Assyria, Babylon, Persia under the Achaemenids, Alexander's conquests, Rome in the west, and eventually in the east, the Han, the Tang, the Mongols, the Abbasids, the Aztec and Inca states, the Ottomans, the Mughals, Spain's empire, Britain's empire. Different continents, different centuries, different technologies, different religions, different systems of government. All gone. That consistency is remarkable enough to demand an explanation, and people have been proposing explanations for over 2,000 years. Some blame moral decay. Some blame money. Some blame climate. Some blame the mathematics of complexity itself. Some argue that the question contains a hidden trick, and that most empires never actually collapsed at all. Let's dig into this properly, because before we look at any explanation, we need to be honest about what the question is smuggling in. Start with the word collapse, because it does an enormous amount of unexamined work. When people say the Roman Empire collapsed, they usually picture a sudden catastrophe. Cities burning, barbarians pouring through gates, civilization switching off. The traditional date given is 476, when the last emperor in the West was deposed. The reality is considerably messier. The eastern half of the same empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years, with its capital at Constantinople, calling itself Roman the entire time, until 1453. The person we call the last Roman emperor was ruling only a fragment of the Western territory, and his removal was barely noticed at the time. Roman law, Roman language, Roman administrative practice, and Roman religious structures continued operating in much of the West under new management. This has produced one of the longest-running arguments in the field. One school, associated with historians who emphasize late antiquity as its own period, argues that what happened was transformation, a gradual reconfiguration in which Roman and Germanic elements blended, elites adapted, and continuity outweighed rupture. Another school pushes back hard, pointing at archaeological evidence for a real and severe material decline, pottery quality dropping sharply, long-distance trade contracting, building in stone nearly ceasing in some regions, literacy narrowing, cattle getting smaller. On that reading, calling it a transformation understates a genuine catastrophe for ordinary people's standard of living. Both sides have serious evidence, and the debate is unresolved. What it establishes for our purposes is that collapse is not one thing. Sometimes it means a state disappears. Sometimes it means a state fragments. Sometimes it means a state is conquered, and its structures continue under a new name. Sometimes it means the political center holds while material life degrades badly. There is also a hidden logical problem in the question. Saying all empires eventually collapse is partly a statement about the definition of eventually. Any empire currently existing simply has not ended yet. The claim is unfalsifiable in the short run and trivially true in the long run. Everything ends eventually, including species and stars. The interesting question is more specific. Why do large political entities appear to have a characteristic lifespan measured in centuries rather than millennia? And what mechanisms drive that? One more definitional point is worth making because it shapes what counts as evidence. Empires end in several distinct ways, and lumping them together obscures more than it reveals. Some are conquered outright by a stronger rival. Some fragment into successor states run by their own former officials and generals. Some are absorbed and continue as provinces of something larger. Some persist in name while real power moves elsewhere, becoming ceremonial shells. And some, particularly in the 20th century, are dismantled deliberately through decolonization, which involves political pressure, independence movements, and the enormous cost of holding territory against populations determined not to be held. That last category matters because a great many of the empire's people have in mind when they ask this question did not fall to invading armies at all. They gave up territory under sustained resistance and shifting international norms, and the metropolitan state survived the loss of empire entirely intact. Whether that counts as collapse depends entirely on where you draw the boundary of the thing being described. Now, we can look at the actual proposals, and there are several serious ones. Let's talk about the oldest sophisticated theory too, because this represents an idea from the 14th century that people keep rediscovering. Ibn Khaldun, a North African scholar writing in the 1370s, produced an analysis of the rise and fall of dynasties centered on a concept he called asabiyya, usually translated as group solidarity or social cohesion. His argument runs roughly like this. Groups living in harsh conditions on the periphery develop intense internal solidarity because survival requires it. That cohesion makes them formidable, and it lets them conquer settled, wealthy, comfortable populations whose solidarity has weakened. Having conquered, the new rulers settle into the comfort they captured. Their descendants grow up in luxury without the conditions that produced the cohesion in the first place. Solidarity erodes across generations. Taxation rises as the ruling class needs more revenue to sustain its lifestyle, and by loyalty it no longer receives freely. The state grows brittle. A new cohesive group arrives from the margins, and the cycle repeats. Ibn Khaldun estimated the whole arc at roughly 4 generations, or about a century. That specific number does not survive contact with the evidence. Plenty of dynasties lasted far longer. But the underlying mechanism, that the qualities which build a state are undermined by the success of that state, has proven remarkably durable as an idea. Let's talk about the theories that shaped popular thinking too, because this represents where most people's assumptions actually come from, even if they have never read the sources. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, produced the most famous account of Roman decline ever written, and its influence on how the English-speaking world imagines empire is difficult to overstate. Gibbon emphasized loss of civic virtue, the corrupting effects of wealth and luxury, reliance on foreign soldiers, and, controversially, the rise of Christianity, which he argued redirected energy away from the state and toward other worldly concerns. Modern historians treat most of this skeptically. The moral decay framework has largely fallen out of favor because it is close to unfalsifiable, and because it tends to reflect the anxieties of the writer's own era rather than evidence from the period being studied. Every generation seems convinced that the previous one was tougher, and reading that intuition backward into ancient sources produces the conclusion you started with. The claim about Christianity in particular has not held up well, given that the Eastern Empire was more thoroughly Christianized than the West and lasted 1,000 years longer. Arnold Toynbee, writing in the 20th century, produced an enormous comparative study proposing that civilizations rise by responding successfully to challenges and fall when a creative minority that once solved problems becomes a merely dominant minority that rules without solving anything, losing the willing allegiance of the population. It is an elegant framework, and it was hugely popular. It has also been criticized heavily for being unfalsifiable and for selecting evidence to fit the pattern. Both are worth knowing because both still shape casual conversation about decline, and both are considerably weaker as analysis than their fame suggests. Let's talk about the complexity argument too, because this represents probably the most influential modern theory. The archaeologist Joseph Tainter proposed that societies solve problems by adding complexity. More administrators, more specialists, more infrastructure, more layers of coordination. Complexity works. It solves real problems. But it has a cost, and the returns diminish. The first road built into a province transforms trade. The 100th road adds much less. The first tier of bureaucracy imposes order on chaos. The 8th tier mostly manages the other 7. The early return on investment in complexity is enormous, and each subsequent increment gives back less while costing the same or more. Eventually, a society reaches a point where added complexity produces almost nothing but still has to be paid for. It is now spending heavily to maintain structures that no longer justify themselves, and it has no surplus left to absorb. Shocks, a drought, an epidemic, a military defeat that a younger version of the same society would have shrugged off becomes an existential crisis, because all the slack has been consumed. In Tainter's framing, collapse is a rapid loss of complexity. And he makes the provocative argument that it can be adaptive. For a peasant farmer paying heavy taxes to support a distant apparatus that provides little in return, the disappearance of that apparatus may be an improvement. Collapse from the perspective of the palace and collapse from the perspective of the village are not the same event. Critics argue the theory is difficult to test, since measuring the marginal return on societal complexity is not straightforward, and that it explains too much by fitting almost any case after the fact. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the demographic and elite competition model too, because this represents an approach that tries to make the question quantitative. Peter Turchin and colleagues developed what they call structural demographic theory, which tracks several variables over time: population relative to resources, the condition of ordinary people, the size and behavior of the elite class, and the fiscal health of the state. The pattern they describe goes like this. A period of stability and growth increases population and generates wealth. Eventually, population growth outpaces resources, wages fall relative to prices, and ordinary living standards decline. Meanwhile, the elite class expands through wealth accumulation, through upward mobility during the good years, through their own reproduction, and grows faster than the number of elite positions available. That produces what Turchin calls elite overproduction. More people with wealth, education, and ambition than there are positions of power to hold them. Competition among elites intensifies, factions form, political norms erode as rivals fight harder for a shrinking prize, and the state becomes both a battleground and a casualty. Combine frustrated elites with a discontented general population and you get instability and, in severe cases, civil war. Turchin has argued this pattern recurs across widely separated societies with rough regularity. The approach has attracted real interest and real criticism, with skeptics questioning the data selection, the periodization, and whether apparent cycles are being imposed on messy history rather than discovered in it. Let's talk about environment and disease too, because this represents the factor historians long underweighted and now take extremely seriously. The evidence base here has expanded enormously in recent decades because ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, cave formations, and ancient DNA now give us climate and pathogen records that written sources never provided. Several correlations are striking. The Akkadian Empire, often described as the world's first empire, fell apart around the same time as a severe and prolonged drought recorded in sediment across the region. The late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw multiple major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean fail nearly simultaneously: Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, and others, amid evidence of drought, famine, migration, and warfare. Roman expansion coincided with a period of favorable climate, and Rome's difficulties coincided with its end. The late Bronze Age case deserves a closer look, because it is the clearest example we have of interconnection turning into a liability. The eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE hosted a truly international system. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the Levantine city-states linked by diplomacy, royal correspondence, dynastic marriage, and heavy trade. Bronze itself required that network, since copper and tin came from widely separated sources, and neither is much use without the other. Within roughly a generation, most of it was gone. Palaces burned, major cities were abandoned or destroyed, writing systems fell out of use in some regions, and the scale of long-distance trade contracted sharply. Proposed causes include drought, earthquakes, famine, internal revolt, migration, and raiding by groups Egyptian sources refer to collectively as the Sea Peoples, and disruption of the metal trade. The explanation most researchers now favor is not any one of those, but the interaction of several, sometimes called a systems collapse, where a tightly linked network amplifies local failures, instead of absorbing them. Each state depended on the others for materials, markets, and security. When several faltered at once, the connections that had made them prosperous became the channels through which failure spread. Disease matters just as much. The Antonine Plague struck the Roman Empire at its height and killed an enormous number of people. The plague of Justinian hit the Eastern Empire during an attempted reconquest of the West and gutted it. The introduction of Old World diseases into the Americas killed a catastrophic proportion of indigenous populations, and the collapse of the Aztec and Inca states cannot be understood without it. The careful position here is that climate and disease are rarely sufficient explanations on their own. Many societies survive droughts and epidemics. What these shocks do is apply severe pressure to structures that may already be strained, and the outcome depends heavily on how much resilience the society had going in. That is where the environmental argument and the complexity argument meet. This detail is worth sitting with directly because it explains why single-cause explanations keep failing. Empires do not usually die of one thing. They die of several things arriving together, while the capacity to respond is already reduced. A fiscal crisis alone is survivable. A plague alone is survivable. A succession dispute alone is survivable. All three in the same decade, in a system with no reserves, is not. Let's talk about the structural problems built into empire specifically too, because this represents something distinct from general societal decline. An empire is by definition rule over people who are not part of the ruling group. That creates permanent problems no amount of good governance fully solves. Distance is the first. Before industrial transport and electronic communication, an order took weeks or months to reach a frontier. Governors far from the center had to be given real autonomy, and real autonomy means real capacity for rebellion. The larger the empire, the worse this gets. And it puts a hard ceiling on how much any center can actually control. Cost is the second. Frontiers must be garrisoned, and garrisons do not generate revenue. Conquest is profitable while it continues, since new territory brings plunder and tribute. Once expansion stops, the empire is paying maintenance costs on everything it took with no new income. Historians have described this as imperial overstretch, the gap between strategic commitments and the economic base available to fund them. Many empires hit their fiscal crisis not during conquest, but shortly after conquest ended. Legitimacy is the third. Subject populations rarely regard foreign rule as rightful, and the memory of prior independence persists across generations. Empires manage this through a mix of coercion, co-option of local elites, and cultural incorporation, and all three are expensive. When the center weakens, peripheries do not need to be defeated militarily. They simply stop complying. Succession is the fourth, and it is a chronic killer. Empires concentrate enormous power in a single office, which makes the transfer of that office extraordinarily dangerous. Hereditary succession produces incompetent rulers on a regular schedule. Non-hereditary systems invite civil war between claimants. Rome cycled through both, and suffered badly from each. A great many imperial crises are, at root, arguments about who should be in charge that were settled with armies. Let's talk about money too, because this represents the mechanism that shows up in more imperial declines than almost any other. And it is unusually visible in the archaeological record. When a state's obligations exceed its revenue, it has a limited menu. It can raise taxes, which is unpopular and produces resistance and evasion. It can borrow, which requires lenders willing to bet on repayment. It can cut spending, which usually means cutting the military that holds the whole structure together. Or it can debase the currency. Debasement means reducing the precious metal content of coins while keeping their face value, allowing the mint to produce more coins from the same amount of silver or gold. It is a hidden tax, and it is politically the easiest option available, which is exactly why it gets chosen so often. Rome's silver coinage provides an unusually clear case. Analysis of the silver content of the denarius shows a long decline across the imperial period from a high-purity coin in the early empire to something that by the 3rd century was largely base metal with a thin silver wash. That period coincided with severe inflation, breakdown of long-distance trade in some regions, and a preference for payment in kind rather than coin. Soldiers and officials increasingly compensated with goods, because the money had stopped being trusted. The pattern recurs elsewhere. Governments under fiscal stress reach for the currency because the damage is delayed and diffuse, while the relief is immediate. By the time the consequences arrive, the officials who made the decision are usually out of office or dead, and the successors face a worse version of the same problem with fewer options. Let's talk about the counterexamples too, because this represents the strongest objection to the whole framing. Chinese history complicates the collapse narrative significantly. Dynasties fall repeatedly: Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, and traditional Chinese historiography has its own long-standing model of this, sometimes called the dynastic cycle. But something reconstitutes each time: the state, the bureaucratic apparatus, the writing system, the classical canon, and the idea of unified rule persist across ruptures. Periods of fragmentation are followed by reunification under a new house. That looks less like collapse than like repeated regeneration of the same underlying structure. Egypt offers a related case with a recognizable civilization spanning roughly 3,000 years, punctuated by intermediate periods of fragmentation followed by reconsolidation. These cases suggest that geography, cultural continuity, and the depth of administrative tradition matter enormously. A society with a deeply entrenched bureaucratic class and a shared literary culture may lose its rulers repeatedly without losing itself. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. The honest answer to why all empires collapse is that there is no single answer, and any explanation confident enough to fit on a poster is almost certainly wrong. What the serious theories share is a common shape. Empires are built by a specific set of conditions: cohesion, expansion, favorable circumstances, an economic base that exceeds commitments. Success then systematically dismantles those conditions. Expansion ends, and the revenue that funded expansion ends with it. Cohesion built in adversity dissolves in comfort. Complexity accumulates, and its returns diminish. Elites multiply and compete. The periphery grows resentful, and the center grows expensive. And then the ordinary shocks that history delivers to everyone: a drought, a plague, a bad emperor, a lost battle, arrive at a system with nothing left in reserve. Rather than dying of external attack, actually most empires appear to have been hollowed out first and pushed over afterward. The invasion is usually the final event rather than the cause. And the people who write the history often mistake the two. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. Every empire that ever fell contained people absolutely certain it would not, and they were reasoning from the same evidence that anyone in a powerful state reasons from today, which is that it has not happened yet.